Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, here in person and those online, I believe we have more than 1,000 people that have subscribed to this program. My name is Kilaparti Ramakrishna, and I'm with the WHOI's Marine Policy Center. And I'm honored to stand before you to moderate this MORS colloquium, a generous gift by Elizabeth W. and Henry A. Morse to the Buesseler Oceanographic Institution. They foresaw the MORS colloquia to heighten awareness and promote understanding among our community that addresses the serious global problems that confront humanity. What you will see this evening is a testament to MORS' vision and WHOI's commitment to understanding, protecting, and harnessing the remarkable capabilities of our oceans. But first, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to James Cameron for sharing his insights on the value of our ocean to make ocean to climate through a short video. James Cameron is a visionary filmmaker and ocean explorer who has brought the mysteries of the deep ocean to the forefront of public awareness. By daring to journey to the deepest parts of our planet, Cameron has inspired countless individuals to join the quest for ocean exploration and conservation.
Hi, I'm Jim Cameron. Welcome everyone to the 2023 MORS Colloquium. Science is in a race to understand the ocean twilight zone and to spotlight its great value before it becomes yet another ecosystem ravaged by human activity. And as you know, the rise and fall from the depth to the surface and back again each day of trillions of animals is the foundation of our ocean food webs and is part of the ocean's vast biological carbon pump. And we love these weird and wonderful creatures. They're climate heroes. They're sequestering at least as much carbon each year as emitted by all the world's automobiles. Tonight's event is part of a 2-week-long international symposium on the mesopelagic. We have gathered here a remarkable, possibly unprecedented, concentration of expertise on the ocean twilight zone. And I so wish I could be there with you, but the demands of Avatar 3 are keeping me here in New Zealand. So do great work and enjoy.
Yes. The ocean twilight zone, formerly known as the mesopelagic zone, lies just before the sunlit surface waters and extends down to depths of around 1,000 meters. It is a world of perpetual twilight, where sunlight barely penetrates. Yet, life thrives in remarkable abundance, and this zone remains one of the least explored and least understood areas of our planet. And yet, it plays a crucial role in the health of our oceans and the stability of our climate. One of the key reasons the ocean twilight zone is of such paramount importance is, as you will hear from our esteemed speakers, its role in the ocean's biological pump. This natural mechanism is a vital part of the Earth's carbon cycle and holds significant implications for mitigating the climate crisis. The natural question is, how does it do this? The answer lies in the undeniable link between the health of our oceans and the stability of our planet's climate. As we confront the looming threat of climate change, we must recognize that the ocean's biological pump is a natural ally in our fight against rising carbon dioxide levels. By delving into the ocean twilight zone and gaining a deeper understanding of the biological processes at play, we can unlock new strategies for enhancing carbon sequestration. This knowledge guides sustainable fisheries, manage fisheries management, and even inspire innovative technologies to replicate and augment the ocean's carbon capturing capabilities. In fact, the ocean's biological pump is estimated to sequester a substantial portion of world's carbon emissions, several billion tons of carbon per year, making it a critical component of our planet's carbon budget. Therein lies the challenge. Our understanding of this complex system is still limited, and the ocean twilight zone remains largely a mystery. What we hope you will take away from this event is our collective commitment to change that. What you will see and hear over the course of this evening is the significance of these concepts and why our gathering today is so momentous. Before I introduce our panelists, we have one more video to show from Ambassador Peter Thompson. Peter Thompson is a tireless advocate for ocean health and sustainability. As a former president of the United Nations General Assembly and now serving as the United Nations Special Envoy on Ocean, Thompson has been instrumental in driving international efforts to protect our oceans and raise awareness about their crucial role in understanding the climate crisis.
Olavinaka, greetings from the sunny islands of Fiji. I would have liked to have been with you today in Woods Hole, but the time and tide have not conspired in my favor. And past visits to Woods Hole have a special place in my memory, and I've long valued the Woods Hole community as a steadfast supporter in our global efforts to reverse the decline of the ocean's health. It goes without saying that the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has been a trusted source of scientific knowledge on the ocean's properties for longer than most of us can remember. I recall as a boy here in Fiji reading National Geographic magazines and becoming aware of the amazing marine adventures emanating from Hui. It was thus quite a thrill over half a century later to visit Woods Hole in my capacity as Fiji's ambassador to the United Nations. I'd like to take this moment to recognize that in our communal responsibility to address global problems, Elizabeth and Henry Morse were visionaries. They envisaged an interdisciplinary link-up between the present and the future, and seeking an integrated overview of research and discovery, expanding dialogue in the cause of better global perspectives. By establishing a perpetual Morse Colloquium Fund, they have enabled Hui to interface effectively with the public, promoting translation of complex scientific findings into more approachable language for you and I to digest. As someone who works intensively in the area of ocean policy, I can attest to the fact that policymakers and scientists need to be more effectively engaged. It is thus highly encouraging for me that the Ocean Twilight Zone project, now in its 5th year of work, has embraced policy influence and public engagement as a critical component on par with its scientific and technological goals. May I also say that I am encouraged that Dr. Ramakrishna, our esteemed moderator tonight, is proving to be so instrumental in bringing together partners from around the world to better understand the positive role that the ocean can play in climate solutions. You may be wondering how relevant all this is to you. Well, one example might be the Resilient Woods Hole Initiative, which is guiding adaptation measures for the town and its institutions with a view to surviving the onslaught of sea level rise. I recall from my last visit to Woods Hole that this is a pressing local issue which will only become more urgent over time. I hope you will take home from tonight's colloquium a heightened awareness of the ocean's outsized role in our climate. For example, I think you'll be fascinated to learn more about the ocean's biological carbon pump, which moves a massive amount of carbon up and down the vast ocean depths and water columns. Most of all, I hope your take-home will be that there still remains so much in the ocean for humanity to discover, understand, and respect, and that we have in Hui a champion interlocutor of ocean discovery and analysis. So on with your program. It was a pleasure addressing you all at this Morse colloquium, and fair winds and farewell from Fiji.
Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce and invite our first speaker, Kristina Gjerde. Kristina is the Senior High Seas Advisor for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey, California, where she teaches an intensive course on international marine law. For almost 30 years, Kristina has worked on the progressive development of public international law relating to the marine environment with a growing focus on the high seas and international seabed area. Her many interests include ocean governance, shipping, fishing, deep seabed mining, as well as tools and technologies for advancing marine biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. She was just named the honorary professor by the University of Edinburgh in recognition of her work with the School of Geosciences and the Law School. And in her spare time, Kristina advances science-based progress. She co-founded and currently serves on the boards of 4 initiatives: Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, Sargasso Sea Project, and the High Seas Alliance. I don't know how she does all that. And is a member of the executive planning group of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. Kristina, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. I've been doing this a long time, is how all of this gets done. So persistence does pay off. I'm excited to be here to join you tonight to talk about another unsung hero of the ocean's biological carbon pump, which is about a new agreement that's been has been adopted and will be open for signature at the United Nations this coming Wednesday during their high-level week. It's called the United Nations Treaty for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity Beyond the Limits of National Jurisdiction. And you'll know why we call it the BB&J Agreement, or the High Seas Biodiversity Agreement for short. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an insider's perspective, as having been part of these negotiations over the past 20 years, to look at the implications of the ocean twilight zone and the biological carbon pump for global ocean law and policy, and why I think this High Seas Agreement is the unsung hero here. We're all aware that climate change is having drastic impacts on the biology, the chemistry, and the physics of our shared ocean. And what the World Ocean Assessment by the United Nations showed in 2015 is the need to take an integrated approach to addressing the multitude of impacts currently affecting the health and resilience of our shared ocean. And the High Seas Agreement, which is dealing in the areas 200 nautical miles beyond national jurisdiction, this map is showing the limits of where the waters are deeper than 200 meters deep. But in many ways, these boundaries overlap, but in many ways they don't. What it's showing us, we need to take a global ocean approach, and the High Seas Biodiversity Agreement at least provides us that platform to deal with 2/3 of the ocean, as well as to lift the capacity of the many developing states who similarly have lots of deep water in their national boundaries to deal with some of the challenges that we're now confronting in climate change. That was what the High Seas Biodiversity Agreement does, is to set forth this platform for global cooperation focused on promoting and enhancing conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity, but also through reflecting the needs for ecosystem resilience and maintaining and preserving and restoring ecosystem integrity. And for the first time, there's specific mention about maintaining the ocean's carbon cycling services. And the need to ensure that the ocean is able to respond and adapt and evolve to the many impacts of climate change, including the cumulative aspects as we're going forward. The treaty, as I said, is opening for signature this coming week. It's hoped that 60 states will rapidly put the agreement through their national processes to enable them to formally ratify the agreement, to bring it into force. We need 60 nations to step forward to sign the dotted line and to implement national legislation. We're hoping that will be done by 2025. That's 2 short years. But already, I think I have heard somewhere between 50 and 100 states may be stepping up to the plate at the United Nations on Wednesday to sign their names, heads of states and heads of governments. The treaty has multiple components, but as I said, its objective, its approach is really how to protect and sustainably manage marine biodiversity while also building and sustaining ecological resilience. I'll give you examples of how this applies to the biological carbon pump after I take you for one of my favorite images that actually shows the complexity and the interaction of the ocean's biological carbon pump as mediated by many of the creatures that live there. For a large part of these creatures, including the lanternfish in the middle, spend half of their time, half of their days or nights, if you will, up in the surface waters and then swim down, the greatest migration of any creature on this planet. And they're bringing their food supply and their poops along with them, if I haven't stole Debbie's thunder. But as you can see, the lanternfish and the other creatures don't live alone. They're connected to the surface. They're actually a food source for albatross. They're a food source for many beaked whales, as well as tuna, swordfish, sea turtles, you name it, are dependent or reliant, at least in some small part, on the services of this ocean ecosystem and ocean climate pump. So why do I think the BB&J, the High Seas Agreement, is the climate hero? Well, for the first time, you have a global arena bringing states together through a conference of parties that is able to evolve the treaty to adapt to changing conditions. As I said, it's focused on building and enhancing ecosystem resilience, ensuring we can manage our ecosystems in a sustainable way. One of the key tools for enhancing and sustaining ecosystem resilience is, of course, marine protected areas. As we have heard, the Convention on Biological Diversity is urging states to establish marine protected areas covering 30% of the ocean by 2030. We can't really do this full 30% if we don't include areas of the high seas, and we can't maintain our ocean's biological pump if we don't also protect and restore the ecosystem processes. At the same time, the treaty is set up to ensure that activities that do go forward in this vast area of the high seas are designed to not undermine ecosystem resilience and to maintain ecosystem integrity, including, of course, the carbon cycling services. And this is going to be critically important in the days as some are starting to look at potential fisheries and mesopelagic resources, looking at deep seabed mining and its potential impacts on in the plume through injecting contaminants and dust particles, if you will, into the middle of the mesopelagic, as well as potential ideas for ocean climate, ocean carbon dioxide removal that could have potential implications for the health and resilience of the ocean carbon cycle. But no treaty stands alone. It is also a fantastic tool to be able to influence and interact with these other important international bodies. Starting with the Paris Agreement is as we better understand how the ocean works and the importance of maintaining the ocean's biological carbon pump, we can ideally ramp up ambition at the national levels as they're setting their nationally determined contributions, as well as providing more platforms for governments to come together to say, hey, we need to find more ways to better respect and appreciate the role of the open ocean and deep sea in carbon sequestration. The Convention on Biological Diversity brings all states together to actually focus on better ways to conserve and manage biodiversity with the vision of course, 100% sustainability as well as 30% protection by 2030. We don't have much time if we're going to get there, but we need to be paying attention to what's going on in these other arenas with respect to high seas fishing. Are they undermining or taking out, or how reliant are they on some of the prey that live in the ocean twilight zone? Ocean climate engineering, how might it interfere? Will it interfere? And if so, how much with the ocean's biological carbon pump? While we're interested in trying to get rid of some of our problems created on land, can we put it just down into the deep sea, expecting nothing to happen worth concern? So I'm very happy to say that after 20 years, this UN High Seas Treaty is now on the books, open for signature, open for nations to stand up, sign, and ratify, and that the scientific community has an excellent opportunity to already help advance the scientific basis for many of the institutions, the processes, the marine protected areas, as well as for providing the wisdom we need to truly ensure informed decision-making in the years to come. Thank you.
you will see very soon in the following presentations how much of the science that scientists will tell us contributed to the kinds of agreements that Kristina talked about. Our next speaker is Kakani Katijaa. Kakani is a principal engineer at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. She earned a PhD in bioengineering from California Institute of Technology and is the lead of the Bioinspiration Lab. Kakani and her group investigates ways that imaging can enable observations of life in the ocean. By developing novel imaging and illumination tools, automating the classification of underwater visual data using artificial intelligence, and integrating algorithms on vehicles for robotic vehicle missions. It is a treat, I tell you, you'll watch it very soon. Kakani and her team are able to consistently and persistently observe ocean life. Their efforts are increasing scientific access to biology and related phenomena in the deep sea. Kakani, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be back in Woods Hole. Just in time for this hurricane, it seems. But anyways, today I get the opportunity to talk to you about ocean observations and how do we actually observe a place like the ocean twilight zone. The plethora of life you come across in the ocean's midwaters is pretty significant. As you see from this array of images that I've downloaded from the MBARI database, there's a breadth of diversity of different types of animals that live there, all evolving to survive in this region, the ocean's midwaters, where animals, maybe their entire life, never contact the surface, right? They never reach the seafloor, they never reach the sea surface, and so that means they've adapted to that environment in really different ways. So examples of these animals, right? You've got squids, obviously jellyfish. There's these long colonial animals called siphonophores, and then also my favorite, giant larvaceans, because they create and secrete these massive mucus structures. I fondly call them snot palaces, that play an incredibly important role in filtering particulate and carbon from the waters around these animals, and then sending carbon rapidly to the seafloor after these animals leave these structures behind to build new ones. So what we know, based on a lot of work that's been done, at least in the Monterey Bay area, is that these giant larvaceans, this process of filtering lots of food and particulate and abandoning these structures to sink rapidly, about 800 meters per day, play an important role, about sinking a third of the particulate in the Monterey Bay area alone. So if this is something that an individual group of animals or an individual species of animals can do, what is possible, right? What are the other contributions that biology might be having to this cycling of carbon? And this is why we need to increase our capacity to observe life there, to understand how many animals, what is their role as well. And so we've been developing a number of different technologies, and I wanted to show you at least a video of the Mesobot. I know that this is a multi-institutional initiative that involves obviously Woods Hole, but also MBARI, Stanford, and University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley. This particular vehicle is designed to operate in the ocean's midwaters. And our group, the Bioinspiration Lab at MBARI, spent a lot of time trying to integrate visual data into the navigation capabilities of this vehicle. And so what that means is just using this visual information, this vehicle can track an individual animal for a long period of time. The goal is to reach 24 hours, so we can get, a day in the life of an animal in the ocean's midwaters. We have obviously a lot more work to go, but this is, one of many tools that we are bringing to bear, right, to understand life in the ocean. There's actually a minion outside, that's an autonomous float. That's a project that's actually being led by Melissa Omond at URI. And there, what the goal is to try and be able to understand how carbon through particle movement or particle transport is being cycled. And one of the things our group is doing, and I know Ken is also involved in that project, is integrating stereo cameras so that we can understand not only the particle sizes, like and maybe quantify the type of carbon or amount of carbon that's being sequestered, but also understand how fast this carbon is sinking by measuring sinking rates directly. But again, in order for us to be able to fill our observational gaps, we have to think more broadly and aggressively around automation and robotics. And so what we're doing now is incorporating artificial intelligence in our vehicles, but also in the analysis of data. And one of the ways that we're doing that, what we're recognizing is that we really need to massively scale the amount of collaboration and cooperation we have to try and fill these knowledge gaps. And so one of the ways we're doing that is not only creating mechanisms for experts to collaborate, but also for ocean enthusiasts to give us or to help us, right, with this ocean discovery process. And so one of the ways we're doing that is we're building big databases like FathomNet. You can check it out on the website. What it is a database repository for labeled data. So data that we know that things are in specific animals, let's say, are in visual data. And the idea here is through FathomNet, you can create models, you can aggregate taxonomic expertise, and you can then share them broadly with the community. In addition to FathomNet, we're also developing a phone-based video game called Fathomverse. And so we're inviting ocean lovers, animal lovers, armchair explorers to participate and help us improve the artificial intelligence that we use to discover life in the ocean and, be part of this entire process. And so far, using FathomNet and the data that we're getting through these data pipelines has really already created an impact. So this is one of the videos that we've collected using our remotely operated vehicles in Monterey. We've deployed one of the algorithms trained on FathomNet, and that's what's creating these bounding boxes, as well as displaying IDs of animals, and even in some cases down to the species level. And so what we know already is that the incorporation of these kinds of algorithms, while they're not perfect, has at least increased the rate of our analysis of this kind of data by an order of magnitude. And as we start building systems that are very focused on improving collaborations between humans and artificial intelligence, we expect this rate to only increase. And so in addition to just applying this data on visual data that we might collect, one of the things that we're also able to do is integrate these algorithms onto our vehicles themselves, pre-programmed to look for animals or features that we want to study. Oops. And what this is a demonstration of us looking for a giant larvacean snot palus. And then on the top left, you'll notice that we transitioned from a search phase to an acquire phase, and then now to a track phase. And so this, I know I sound very excited, but I really am. And so what this means is now we have the capability to observe these animals and also the ability to scale up our observations of this particular place and animals that live there. And so the hope is that over time, as we incorporate automation, as we incorporate new robotic vessels or vehicles that allow us to see the space, we can fully understand the life that lives there in the ocean's midwaters. Thank you very much.
Amazing technology there. Thank you, Kakani. And our next speaker is Professor Deborah Steinberg. Debbie is a professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Her research interests include the role of zooplankton in cycling of carbon and nutrients and the food web of the ocean twilight zone. She has worked in several marine environments, including coastal California, the Antarctic, the Sargasso Sea, the North Pacific, the Amazon River plume, and the Chesapeake Bay. Debbie earned her PhD at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and before joining the Virginia Institute in 2001, she was a research fellow at UC Santa Cruz and a research scientist at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. She serves in numerous leadership positions in the broader oceanographic community. Of special note, she was awarded the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award the highest honor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, that the Commonwealth of Virginia bestows upon faculty at Virginia colleges and universities. Debbie, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm going to dig into this biological carbon pump a little bit here and tell you why it's a climate hero. So what you're seeing here is a time series of human activities releasing carbon through burning of fossil fuel and also land use changes, which is mostly deforestation. And so those are sources of carbon, anthropogenic sources of carbon. And the sinks for this carbon are the ocean, the land, and then some of this carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere, and that's what's leading to global warming. And what I want to tell you is that the oceans absorb about 25% of this anthropogenic or human CO2 that's going into the atmosphere. And so the oceans are very, very important in the carbon cycle on our planet. Now, this is a diagram, sort of a simplistic diagram of the ocean's biological carbon pump. And this is the suite of biological processes that move carbon out of the atmosphere and into the deep ocean. And so phytoplankton, I'm going to sort of go through these processes with you. So phytoplankton, or the microscopic plants in the surface ocean through photosynthesis, take up this carbon dioxide. And in turn, they're eaten by small drifting animals called zooplankton, which are in turn eaten by fish. And in this way, carbon from the atmosphere makes it into the surface waters of the ocean and into the ocean food web. Now, what happens next is there are sort of three main ways that carbon makes it into the deep ocean. It's exported into the deep sea. And those processes include just sinking of dead stuff, dead phytoplankton, also the fecal pellets or poop of animals, and those kind of aggregate together and sink out of the surface waters into the deep ocean. So that's one of the important pathways of the biological carbon pump. Another one is this diel vertical migration, this movement of mesopelagic animals from the deep waters in where they reside during the day into the surface waters at night, where they feed under the cover of darkness. And so that's to avoid getting eaten, basically. And they munch in the surface waters, and then they swim back down to depth. And that daily movement of animals, as you heard, the largest migration on Earth, is moving carbon into the deep ocean. Another process is just physical mixing of this organic carbon into the deep ocean, just sort of injecting particles and dissolved organic material into the deep sea. So on the right here, what you're seeing is a sort of a picture of what we call marine snow, these detrital particles that are sinking out of the ocean. It's maybe about 0.5 millimeter in size, and there's all kinds of stuff in there. There's a fecal pellet and even little animals there. And what happens is, as this material is sinking out of the surface waters, it's getting gobbled up by the food web in the ocean's twilight zone, because they really rely on this rain of material from surface waters for their nutrition. So as this material is sinking, there's less and less of it with depth. And so what happens is a very small amount of the carbon that's sinking out from the surface waters makes it into the deep ocean. And we call that being sequestered. This makes it into the deep sea, where it's far away from the surface, and we don't have that carbon in contact with the atmosphere for a long time, where it can contribute to global warming. And so there's a lot of processes happening in the ocean twilight zone that we're studying to figure out how fast this material is cycling and how much of it is being sequestered in the deep ocean. So how deep that carbon gets is really important for our ocean's climate. And it's all those critters and processes there in the ocean twilight zone that really play a very important role in getting that carbon to depth. And so this biological carbon pump exports on the order of 10 gigatons of carbon per year, so billions of tons of carbon per year. This is twice the annual accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and 4 times the annual net flux of carbon dioxide into the ocean. So consequently, very small changes in, say, the photosynthesis rate or primary production of the microscopic plants in the surface waters, or changes in export of carbon, very small changes can significantly affect the magnitude of the biological carbon pump. And thus, this sort of partitioning of carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere. And so without the biological carbon pump, the atmosphere CO2 would be about 50% higher. So the last thing I want to leave you with is that the structure of the biodiversity of the organisms that live in the ocean are going to really matter for carbon export. And just like on land, in different regions of the world's oceans, there are different groups of plants and animals. And I'm showing you an example from one of our cruises in the subarctic Pacific, where these big copepods, these little crustaceans the size of a grain of rice, are really abundant. In the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, we have these large diatoms, which are phytoplankton that can aggregate together and sink out and transport a lot of carbon. Large zooplankton like this krill and these pelagic snails or pteropods and salps. And then in the tropics and subtropics, we have these very diverse communities and the food web there starts out with these very small plants called picoplankton, and these are the size of bacteria, so very small phytoplankton that don't sink very quickly, and they're fed upon by a whole range of different organisms and of different sizes. And what I want to show you is that for these copepods and krill, and then you notice I got salps here in a nice highlighted yellow box. And what I want to do, and I'm so excited to show you their fecal pellets here, or poop, and that are a really important part of the biological carbon pump. And so those salps, these gelatinous zooplankton, produce these very large poops, and they sink really fast on the order of 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet per day, which is about 5 times faster than the fecal pellets from the krill here, or 10 times faster than those from the copepod fecal pellets. And so if we've got salps around, that's carbon sequestration. And so it really, the food web matters, and it's not something that most humans see, right, in the ocean twilight zone. And it's, it's such a fundamental part of our ocean ecosystem and fundamental for carbon sequestration. And so, but it's largely out of our sight. So we're just trying to bring that to you today so you realize how it is a climate hero. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Now, last but not least, Ken Buesseler. Ken is a senior scientist in WHOI's Marine Chemistry and Geochemistry Department. He joined WHOI first as a WHOI MIT Joint Program PhD student over 35 years ago. He's a marine radiochemist who studies the fate and distribution of radioactive elements in the ocean. Ken's lab has been active in response to human-caused releases of radioactivity in the environment, tracking and monitoring radioactivity released into the ocean by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster, and from earlier sources such as Chernobyl and atomic weapons testing at the Marshall Islands. He was widely quoted in recent days after the decision by the Japanese government to release the waters. Ken also uses naturally occurring radioactive elements to study the ocean carbon cycle. Ken serves as the principal investigator for carbon and climate on WHOI's Ocean Twilight Zone project. And he's a specialist in marine carbon dioxide removal techniques with a focus on iron fertilization. And he's also the founder of Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions, a group that brings together a number of scientists from around the world to fully understand the implications of it. Ken, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rama, and thank you all for coming, and those online. Well, it's a blustery night out there. I'm going to try and tell a kind of an optimistic story, I think, about how these climate heroes might help us reduce or reverse some of the pain and loss due to climate change, and how that we might be able to affect that. So that's what I want to bring us to by the end. And I need to show you this one graph because it really has two processes that we know something about that are needed to stabilize climate. And Deb's graph, I think, went up to at the present time. This is going to the future, 2100, and it's a plot of our emissions of carbon dioxide here, human emissions, and a timeline here that has a dark gray section, the reduction of greenhouse gases by reducing fossil fuel use. That's essential. No matter what we're talking about to stabilize climate, we have to reduce our emissions, right? And we know how to do that with things like solar and wind and other technologies, increasing efficiencies. That's by far the biggest part of our challenge moving ahead. The blue part you may not have thought as much about, but it's not equally important, but definitely we've come to the conclusion that we need that as well in order to stabilize this climate. It's called negative emissions here. We often call it carbon dioxide removal. It's taking out what's already in the atmosphere. But we put a lot of carbon dioxide out there that's causing these problems. So how do we do this? How do we get up to a point around mid-century where we can balance emissions, and beyond that, there'll always be some greenhouse gas emissions, most likely, but how do we remove what's there to stabilize our climate? That's really the challenge. And I'll talk a little bit about the scale of this, billions of tons. I think Debbie used gigatons. It's a big scale. It's a problem that's planetary and something we really have to take hold of if we want to make a dent in this type of curve. And so thinking of those scales, Debbie talked about how 25% goes in the ocean now, 25% to land plants, the rest ends up with the atmosphere. This is a little different. This is looking at how much is there in each of those different reservoirs. How many billion tons are in the atmosphere? That number is 600. Deep ocean, you probably see already, is the biggest circle there. 37,000 gigatons, billion tons of carbon are stored in the deep ocean. 2,500 all land plants and soils combined. So when you're thinking of manipulating or understanding the carbon cycle, you know, where does it go, and how could we influence how much gets into each of these sinks, these reservoirs? And so it's important to know here that that deep ocean reservoir is the biggest, 50 times larger than what's in the atmosphere. And one thing that astounded me when I first kind of looked at it is, you know, there's 15, 20 times more carbon in this deep ocean reservoir than all of the land plants and all of the surface soils. So we ignore the ocean at our peril if we're thinking about what we can do about climate, or even just predicting how it will change in the future. That's a very important part of it. That number, actually 37,000, is so large, we could take all of the human emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and that would nudge that number by less than 1%. So that is a big number, and that's what we're talking about, trying to nudge perhaps as I move forward here in this part of the presentation. But I also want to kind of bring home, you know, what is a billion tons? I mean, it's just hard to imagine how many elephants, how you want to do it. But I found this one quite useful. A billion tons of carbon. Think of a train pulling coal. Each of those coal cars are about 15 meters, 50 feet long, and they carry about 100 tons of carbon in the form of coal. So if I want to have a train that can pull and move 1 billion tons of carbon, that train would have to circle the equator 4 times, 4 entire times. So again, that's the scale of what we have to deal with. When we're talking heroes here, we're really talking superheroes. They have to do a lot, and we have to get several of these billion tons out per year if we want to follow that curve that I just showed you. But so think of that, a train circling the equator 4 times, that gets you 1 of these gigatons, 1 billion tons. So the question several of us were asked by the national academies to work on a consensus report of, well, could the ocean remove even more? Can we get more into those reservoirs, particularly the deep ocean? And so we were tasked to look at 6 of them. And I'm going to go through these pretty briefly, focusing later on ocean iron. And kind of on the left, we have this nature-based solutions. On the right, more engineered. And on the left, the ones that are probably easiest to understand are growing plants, seaweed, or these phytoplankton that Debbie talked to us about. So plants through photosynthesis take up carbon dioxide. They produce oxygen. Those plants in the ocean alone produce half of the oxygen on this planet. So it's a lot of activity for these microscopic plants that need nutrients to grow. So we looked at how we might enhance that. I'll talk about that in particular. But also seaweed farming as a way to expand what we do along the coast into the open ocean to get to those larger scales. So we looked at those 2 nature-based solutions. You'll see there's a slightly bigger circle in yellow than ecosystem recovery. There's, of course, a lot of carbon stored in the plants and animals that live in the ocean. This is an open ocean example. But it's a little bit smaller because we all, I think, in our hearts want to protect those ecosystems to see them expanded, but it's not enough stored there, millions of tons, not billions, to turn that climate dial. So the only reason, one reason it's a little smaller in my interpretation of the value of these is that it just isn't going to be big enough. It's something we definitely could do today, and we should be doing with these acts to protect 30 by 30. Let's go to another big circle here on the right, ocean alkalinity. I'm not going to do any chemical equations here, even though I'm in the chemistry department. It's basically taking ground up minerals, rocks, and trying to affect the chemistry of the ocean by distributing that on beaches or in the ocean to allow more carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere to more readily dissolve into the ocean. That's a chemical process. We can do it in the lab. I could do it in a small beaker. How can we do that at scale is a question many scientists are asking right now. But it could be scaled up. It would take a lot of crushed rock, billions of tons, to affect billions of tons of removal. But that certainly is what happens in nature with processes like weathering of rocks on longer time scales. So all of these are about speeding up what's happening naturally. Briefly, ocean tubes there, the small one on the left, that's bringing up water. And the reason that's a bit smaller is we can use wave pumps, other forms to get that water up without consuming a lot of energy. But that brings up nutrients, so that enhances the production and this biological pump. But it also brings up carbon dioxide that got there on all of those sinking pellets. And so it seems like it's got a double duty to do. It has to remove as much as it brings up in addition. So that's the only reason that's a little smaller. And the electrochemistry on the right just takes a lot of energy to electrochemically either split out carbon dioxide and store it or change the alkalinity of the chemistry itself. So you need many, many factories and lots of fossil fuel-free energy to go down that path. But basically the academies, we looked at all of these, and the example I'll give is ocean iron, but they have the similar uncertainties, similar questions, and we should be looking at all of them. So my last couple of slides, let's look at ocean iron. And for those that haven't heard about this, plants need sunlight, they need warm waters usually. In your garden, you need nitrogen and phosphorus, you need fertilizers, and iron is one of those essential nutrients. Not very much is needed, and that's one advantage. A little iron goes a very long way to make things grow in the ocean. We showed 15, 20 years ago, people in the audience here were on some of those experiments leading that if you add iron, areas that are typically dust limited, most of the iron in our ocean comes from dust from land. So if you go to those places that don't have a lot of dust, we can enhance the green stuff. We can make things grow, and that was definitively shown. But what we haven't done well, and what I think our group is going to look at is, okay, what's the fate of that material? And so how durably is that stored? How big can that be scaled? what are the intentional ecological impacts and unintended. We're trying to grow things that are naturally occurring, but we're giving the advantage to some, in this case, diatoms. What are the costs? My last slide is about ethical standards, but this group, it's been kind of satisfying for me to see the scientific community. We call ourselves Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions because we want to be clear, we do not have a solution, but it's exploring that's important. It's the science that has to come first. We're really not comfortable with the idea that we should be selling carbon credits, even on a voluntary market, until we really know all of the impacts, what the effects might be. And so we're trying to do this more from a ground-up approach rather than commercialization, but there are other ways forward in this field. But I feel comfortable doing this as a scientist, and one reason is the first thing we decided we had to do is like come up with some principles, right? How we do this can be as important as what we do. And by that, I mean the principles or code of conduct by which you might undergo research on these big global problems that affect people using the ocean commons, things that are outside of the territorial waters that the BBNJ and others control. So these, I'll just go briefly through them, but we certainly want to have as our first order principle, we're trying to do this for the benefit of humans and the environment. That's our motivation. We need real responsibility to oversee these types of studies. We need to know what those guidelines are. We need open and cooperative research. That's easy for a scientist to say, that's what we do. So this has to happen in that way. We've brought together right now, I think it's 30 institutions, 17 countries, 50 scientists. So I think that idea fits very well with where we're coming from. We need iterative and independent assessments. It's not going to just be one group. So we have to build that in. That's what markets would demand. That's what governments would demand if this moves forward. And we certainly need to be engaging the public right from the start in considering what these options are, doing something like this versus essentially doing nothing, watching what we're seeing now, which is what we're trying to reverse or at least slow down. One thing maybe it didn't say well enough after that slide with the 6 different methods, we said, let's do it all. It really gets down to, there's no single silver bullet here. We call it kind of silver buckshot, right? You're going to need lots of solutions at the same time to make a dent on the scale of multiple billions of tons. So I'll just end by saying, we know the ocean takes up carbon dioxide. The question is, how much and can we influence how much gets deep? Can we do that in a responsible way? And so kind of in this climate hero theme, the biological carbon pump is one obvious way. If you saw those 6, at least 3 involved the biological carbon pump. Debbie's slide of cell pellets, I would have ended on something like that because it's the poop that matters. It's the way, how you get it quickly to the bottom, and that's how you get it durably stored, because most of what nature does is recycles the carbon, and we want to look at that longer term to influence our climate. So with that, we'll break the panel.
If I could kindly ask all our panelists to come more to the center and also have the lights on. Paul, thank you. The billion tons that Ken talked about, the carbon, the good strain going around the Earth about 4 times. Another way of thinking about that is the annual carbon emissions of a country like Germany or Japan, total. That is just 1 billion. Or, as James Cameron talked about, the total emissions coming out of navigation and aviation exercise for 1 year. So it's big stuff, and that the oceans and through the biological pump can do that is really quite extraordinary. We started about 5 minutes late, so but our speakers are right on time with their presentations. So the plan now is that I ask them a few questions and then open it up for your comments as well as those coming online. And then I ask all of us to be very disciplined in terms of really being short with the questions. But the first question that I have is for anyone on the panel that want to speak about it is that we recognize the value of oceans and the role that they play in stabilizing the global climate. But many of the commentators, including the United Nations through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and various other things, have not factored that in. A person like Bill Gates, who has spoken extensively about the problem and what needs to be done to solve it. In his book on how to avoid climate disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need didn't mention ocean even once. Would any of you like to respond to that and say why this omission was a missed opportunity and how the ocean plays a major role in ocean's climate?
Well, I guess I can start by saying it's, you know, partly maybe we're not, as scientists, doing our job to communicate that, and also so we can do better. And I also think that it is one of these sort of out of sight, out of mind things, right? It's people, you can see trees growing, you know, you can see the sky, but you can't see the midwater, and so those are two.
Yeah.
But I'll just say, I mean, the scientists have been doing an amazing job in bringing awareness of the ocean's importance to the climate change. That there have been pavilions, there have been events, there's been amazing attention paid to the importance of the ocean in the climate change discussion. Perhaps it hasn't percolated out to those who are not attending the meetings, and perhaps we haven't had enough media attention to the very important contributions that scientists have been making. Hopefully that will change in the very near future.
Okay, Kristina, if I could continue with that, what do you think needs to be done for the policymakers to take deep ocean as a climate solution in the emerging policies? I mean, I know you've talked about the high seas agreement, the BBNJ, but looking more at the climate, is it more science? Is it getting the science to be in front of the policymakers? What do you think should be done?
Well, I'm the type who wants all of the above. That we definitely need more science. We need to be able to understand the implications of what it is we're proposing, but we also need to perhaps take the policymakers to see that, or at least to give them a proxy experience about what it's like and what the relative value and importance of the ocean is to other types of carbon services and carbon cycles. I think the information needs to be packaged in a palatable way. Perhaps the phone games that we can do to sort of understand the interactions of all these various components need to be brought forward and made more accessible.
Thank you. Kakani, if I may ask you this next question. With the temperature increase and how the surface water is warming to a record levels, etc. One of the expressions that has come up very frequently is that ocean has a fever and is becoming sour and breathless. Can you explain this statement and why is this happening and how concerned should we be?
Yes, I think it's a nice way to kind of put forth this idea, or at least the reality that the ocean faces. Right, the ocean is getting warmer. It's also acidifying, so it's becoming less basic, more acidic, and it's also we're seeing a reduction in oxygen. And what that is, right? Those are the costs, right, that it takes, right, for the ocean to have borne this brunt of additional carbon dioxide that we've released as part of, our activities and our actions by burning fossil fuels. And with that, those costs have very real implications, right? If you have increasing temperatures, we're already seeing coral bleaching that's happening on these massive scales. You also see that, animals are changing their locations, their ranges, right? They're moving around and moving to places that make them perhaps more vulnerable. And that can have impacts, right, on food webs that we rely on. With ocean acidification, you've got a reduction, right, in carbonate ions being available to shelled organisms like shrimp, crabs, oysters, things, again, we love to eat. And so that's having an impact. And then last but not least, right, we've got oxygen. What's happening is we're starting to suffocate the animals that are in the ocean, and that has implications, right? A reduction in ocean wildlife. And of course, that's really important to a lot of communities, not just ours. And so I think this is something that we all, everyone on the planet, should be concerned about, because this isn't a problem that's just going to magically go away. And so we have to be vigilant, right? We have to be active. And we also need to be involved and think about really creative ways to engage a lot of people in these challenges and these problems, because it's important to more than just scientists and research.
Right. Thank you. If I could follow up on that with Debbie. Debbie, given what we just discussed in Kakani's answer, you talked about the biological pump, and how is that being impacted by this climate change?
Right, so all of those things that Kakani just talked about are going to affect the distribution of animals in the sea, their abundance, and so just to give a couple of examples, the changing range of organisms in the tropics and subtropics, we tend to have much smaller zooplankton, and as the water warms, their ranges are moving northward. And they're smaller animals. They produce smaller sinking fecal pellets. They're displacing larger, more polar animals, which produce bigger particles. So that's one example. That's going to decrease the strength of the biological carbon pump. Another example, the migrating animals, diel-vertical migrators. Some of them, low oxygen zones are a barrier to their migration. So as the low oxygen zones in the ocean expand, as you have the migrators are not going to be going down as deep as they used to when they're going down to their daytime residence depth. And so they won't be carrying that carbon from the surface waters as deep as they used to. And so it's not going to be sequestered for as long. So those are just a couple of examples how all those things that Kakani talked about, those are going to affect the organisms and thus the pump.
Ken, if we have seen both from Kakani and Debbie's answers that climate impacts are deteriorating the health of the oceans. Given that, can we still manipulate the ocean to take in more carbon dioxide? Are we producing a solution, or are we making matters worse?
And I think that's a question, right? We don't know whether we could at some scale and whether we should. And I think that's really the regret I have as we stopped doing some of these iron experiments due to some public pressure 15, 20 years ago. And so we don't have a lot of answers that we could have by now. It's going to take 5 or 10 years just looking at one of those circles, iron fertilization, before I can give you some maybe quantitative numbers on how we might intentionally, responsibly remove carbon in some areas, what those effects would be. And again, I think today what we're seeing is comparing that to doing nothing. And I think that's what we all want to avoid. You just open up the newspaper, everywhere we live, someone you know is experiencing some consequence of climate change. And so I think it's on us to look hard to get an answer to that question. So I'm not trying to punt on it, but I think that's what we really have to do is get the science, get the research, and move in multiple ways forward to see if we can alter that status quo.
I mean, clearly we need to know a lot more about the biological pump and how it is impacted by the climate impacts and what might happen with whatever that you're suggesting. Is there anything that the panel as a whole or any of you can say, what is it that we need to know on an urgent basis to understand and find these solutions? Understand more about the biological pump.
I mean, there's a cadre of people in this audience, who've come together and next week talking about all of our uncertainties, right? The science we need. And I think, the gaps sometimes are known. So I was going to almost ask you, Debbie, when we talk about the changing biological pump, it's often single stories of certain groups of animals at a certain location. We really just don't have that distributed understanding of the carbon cycle, and particularly this carbon flux, the marine snowfall. And we do know it varies from place to place, season to season. Some other reasons, salt pellets and none. But putting that larger picture together is what the scientific community is really challenged to do over these next years. And it's not going to be easy. How many ROVs would we need to
Too many.
around to do that?
I need autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
And I'd say something encouraging about these past 3 days of meetings is really the mix of disciplines that we've been able to get here. And I think you really need the biologists and the ecologists and the social scientists to be participants in trying to assess the potential impacts of chemical solutions to the climate problem that we've created. That's because we don't know how far we can actually tinker with this biological pump without having more difficulties than we anticipate. Debbie was just explaining that the oxygen minimum zone is a barrier for migration for many species down in the waters. If you are adding more nutrients into the water column and hence potentially expanding this oxygen minimum zone, is that going to create an additional barrier to migration, and your carbon will not actually get below that. So we need to know how all these pieces of puzzles fit together, and we need to be humble and I think show respect for the ecosystem.
Right. Well, thank you. Now it's your turn. We have two microphones, and if you could kindly raise your hand, and please keep your question as brief as possible, and if you can also direct it to one of the panelists, that would be helpful. And we also have some online questions, but I'll come to that. But let me first take the gentleman way at the back. Yeah, right.
Good evening, all. Thank you, presenters. That was very great. Please, can you throw more light on how the business community will be more engaged, because they are the beneficiaries of science and policy? Thank you.
Who would like to address that? Anybody from the panel?
Was the question about bringing them in more to support the science? My comment was going to be on the CDR side, on the commercialization of carbon removal. Seems to be happening right away, right? If we talk 1 billion tons of carbon at $100 a ton, we're talking an economy that doesn't exist. That could be hundreds of billions of dollars. And right now, there's a Wild West scramble to kind of come up with ways to be part of that. And that's part of the business. That's why I asked. I'm not sure I like that model in the way that they're moving faster than we can provide answers. They have 1 or 2 scientists trying to come up with a way to make a bigger dent in carbon, but not necessarily following the full ecological impacts or long-term or downstream effects. I think that is worrisome to me. So that side of this, whether markets are the best way forward, they certainly can scale to those numbers pretty quickly, but we certainly don't want to start something with CDR removal that has as harmful effect as fossil fuel emissions did in the first place.
Yeah, where I was reflecting to is you're talking about policy that will mitigate or reduce the impact of climate change. Now, the business communities are the ones benefiting from the research of the science, and they are the ones benefiting from the politicians. What will be their role to conserve the 30 by 30? That's what I'm reflecting to. Thank you.
We'll give it a try. Well, we need the business community involved in actually finding ways to restrain commercial behavior for the better good of the planet. They need to be part of the solutions as well. I think Ken's concern is when people are looking at new technologies, untested technologies, and what their impacts could be, and if you try to scale them up before we have international governance system in place, and appropriate environmental impact assessments in place, then we could be in serious trouble. But the business community is engaged, but perhaps not as much as they might be in wider circles of, helping to restore coral reefs in tropical islands, of helping to reduce CO2 emissions themselves by looking up their own supply chains. How do we act to behave more responsibility in our own CO2 emissions or those? So there's many ways that business can contribute, and they're welcome to contribute. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves in the game of who can make the most money out of CO2.
Right. The business community has a vital role, and that role, first and foremost, is if they are basing their business activities on burning fossil fuels, is stopping them. And second, using the opportunities that we have, as presented by the panelists, in terms of trying to find answers, so that whatever intervention that we make is going to be the right one. And then comes the treaty procedures and the market mechanisms, and we can deal with it at that time. That's when the business community could benefit from it. So, any other questions? Yes, right in the front.
Ray Schmidt, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. One thing you haven't mentioned is that warming ocean is also a more stratified ocean, so it's slowing down the physical pump. The part of the ocean uptake of CO2 relies on cold water at high latitudes of CO2. And so that's slowing down. And the stratification is inhibiting vertical mixing, which is decreasing ocean productivity. I think there's no doubt that we need to enhance ocean productivity, if only for the protein to feed 10 billion people. And the last point I'll make is relating to this last question. We've just experienced we are experiencing the warmest year on record, the hottest summer on record, incredible floods in places they've never seen them, wildfires and droughts, tropical islands burning up. I think the need is enormous. We have to act quickly on climate change, and people are in the business community, the whole world needs solutions. And I think there's going to be pressure on us slow, indecisive scientists to move and to move quickly. So I think the challenge for all of us is how do we get that research done so we can make wise decisions, because the pressure is enormous. We need solutions, we need them quickly.
That's a nice comment, thank you. Anybody would like to respond to that?
Yeah, I might have something to respond to that. I mean, as we know, right, climate change, these global emissions, right, it's a big problem. But the ocean is one of many solutions that we're looking at. For example, this is something that I think I spend a lot of time thinking about lately. The transportation sector, right? That alone contributes about 30% of the greenhouse gases, right, that we are struggling to reduce. And while, yes, we want to embrace new technologies, there are existing less sexy solutions that will actually have a massive dent in that budget. And that is public transportation, cycling infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, trains. I'm not talking new technology. I'm talking about things we know how to do. We just have to implement them at scale. We're seeing that being done in other places. We're not seeing that being done in the United States. So that can be done regardless of what we're doing in the ocean. And I think, right, the whole point is we have to utilize all of our options to address this challenge.
I'd also like to say that, the urgency, I know what you're feeling. It takes decades to start programs at NSF to get the resources. And so we basically, with EXO, basically started the program before we had that in place, thinking that if we can present these to, philanthropies, agencies, individuals, they could make a difference. We can put this together much faster. We have the tools to go out and do some of these experiments today, tomorrow, as soon as we can get those ships and permits. And so I think the traditional mode of doing science really doesn't apply, and some of the urgency, some of the questions we're asking that is really basic. almost like engineering, systems engineering, as much as science. How much can we get out in the case of CDR, the atmosphere, how durable, other effects. And we've got to find ways to do that more quickly than a traditional 35-year history of studying the biological carbon pump. That's what's motivating me right now.
But I think what we've been hearing is this is not just an engineering solution. This is a biological solution, that an ecosystem that also is going to respond in as yet unknown ways. So we have a responsibility to move, not recklessly, but with full awareness of what the consequences are. And I think, as Kakani said, we have many solutions quickly to hand that can be deployed rapidly than some of these more untested solutions. And yes, I mean, I would agree we need to do some testing and understand what the consequences would be, what the potential effectiveness will be. But I think we do have the weight of the world's responsibility and equity in mind. Who is this going to affect? Who has access to these technologies, and how are they going to be deployed in a way that doesn't benefit some nations that others? We could have new causes for world war.
Thank you. Yes, right in the front.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Craig McLean. My question is towards industry, and to follow the gentleman's question as to roles of industry. When science pursues something new like this, the integrity of the institution is to publish one's work. When the private sector pursues initiatives like this, the institutional integrity is to claim one's work as proprietary for the purposeful gain in revenue. So are there comments from the panelists as to how we can guide both academic research, publicly funded or privately funded academic research would largely publish? How do we deal with the potential of private interests for profit and what the results might be if they're not optimistic? And how do we make sure that we find out about that rather than just continuing to buy a service that is not productive? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to comment on that?
I mean, maybe this is a bit naive, but I would really love to see the business community take on the similar code of conduct, right? Could they behave in this ethical, same standards? We all have the same standards for moving forward. So then it wouldn't really matter whether it's commercially or not. Someone could make a profit doing really good things for the planet, right? And so, but I think if they're more upfront about their standards that they're using, and if they're going to be open, if they're going to be behind a closed door with their intellectual property and not sharing, I think the more open we can make that process and get them to agree. And I would think that would help the bottom line, because perhaps if people see value in that, the price per ton for that type of carbon removal would be higher than for some back alley business that just sells you a piece of paper. And that's mostly what's happening right now. And so I think getting them to sign on to a code of conduct and really responsible MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification standards that are independent would go a long way maybe to bringing them in as part of this solution.
But just to add, I think you've raised a very important question, and my fear would be that a code of conduct is not really sufficient to disincentivize the proprietary interest that will arise in this context. So I think it deserves much further consideration and probably government intervention to actually try to ensure that these technologies are open, that they're verifiable, and that they're tested, and that they're presented in a credible way. Otherwise, we're going to get into the same situation we had in 2007, which is what Ken is complaining set back the research field.
We really need to develop these technologies and to understand where we are going with it. Kakani, the question that I have for you is, we oftentimes say we know more about the dark side of the moon than what we have in our own oceans. I mean, you have shown us the Fathom Net and other things. And so what more does it take to make that technology, developing those kinds of technologies and making them more economically viable so that we know everything? I mean, Ken talked about MRV. I mean, again, we need technologies to monitor those things. What do you feel about that?
In terms of scaling
In terms of what we need to do, is it governmental intervention? Is it the private sector? All of them? And
it's all of it. No, I mean, I think it's, it's a challenging problem, especially when you think about historically the ways in which we've been observing the ocean, right? The activities that we normally do, right, is very siloed. Certain institutions have access to deep sea through research vessels or robots, and that, isn't widely shared or easily accessible. And so it's we know that's a big challenge, and there's a couple of, things that are percolating up that look really good, like good options. We're starting to see people focusing on creating low-cost solutions. But when I say low cost, I don't mean low capabilities. I'm talking about, something that is low cost and capable, and is streamlined and easy to use for individuals with, minimal training, but also thinking a lot too about not just getting the data, but also analyzing that data, right? There's a lot of information that our community has already collected. That's why anytime I hear someone say we know more about the moon or Mars than we do the ocean, that is probably not true. We have collected a ton of information. We've published a ton of papers, but really if we want to fill these observational gaps, we need the ability to scale not only our observations, but our ability to analyze this information as it comes in. So I mentioned, artificial intelligence, but what I've thought a lot about more recently is, how do you engage people from lots of different backgrounds, not just experts, in this challenge, right? Because, if we want to be able to successfully understand how these activities, let's say new technologies, carbon dioxide removal, like how that impacts these, let's say, biological communities, we have to not only just observe them once, right? We have to monitor them repeatedly. So how are we going to do that at scale? And this is where, inviting lots of individuals in to, assist us with this process, I think is going to be incredibly important.
There was a great example at our meeting of this today about cruises with remotely operated vehicles that were operating around the world and streaming the footage from that live, where any scientist or citizen could watch it and use that information, count animals and identify them. And we have some great technology for sharing this information very widely. And I think in our field, the data is very open. We're required to get the data in a timely manner so other people can use it. So I think we're on the right track. And like you said, the urgency, we need to come together in a more cohesive way so we can get that information, all that good data to people who can take it and analyze it and help us.
Thank you. Phil, any questions from online?
Yes, Phil Renaud here, OTZ Program Manager. I'm kind of representing the virtual audience online tonight. A lot of lively interactions from the online community and obviously a lot of well-informed people online tonight. And there's frustration being voiced here about our collective inaction to solve this problem by using the ocean. There's also some skepticism about actually moving the needle on the carbon budget by some of these methods that Ken talked about, iron fertilization and changing the alkalinity. But and there's a lot of great specific questions about the biological carbon pump in here, but I was most fascinated by a question that said, if we had all the billionaires in the world on this webinar tonight, and they were willing to stroke a check to all of us to actually solve this problem, what would that look like? How much money would we really need? When you look at how much money we spent to put that beautiful James Webb Space Telescope, the billions we spent on that, and what little money's going to the ocean, Do you have a figure in your head about what scale of funding it would take to really move this needle?
Billions. That's very hard.
Specific to the CDR, the 6 methods, and we looked at that.
Yeah.
We came up with estimates around $1 billion over 5 to 10 years. And that included not just the natural science, but social science, governance, things to test just those 6. And I've heard from other groups to say that's a vast underestimate. So that might sound like a lot of money to people here, but again, if you think of this emerging market that's coming forward already, that's already at $1 billion plus for voluntary credits, this really isn't a lot of money to get the answers we need. So I don't think these are astronomical costs relative to the cost of what the return might be, or just the damage and loss and suffering that comes with it around the globe. So I think this is a cheap thing. We should be doing this all hands on deck, get those people in the room. We need to talk to them. And we are talking to some of them, getting responses.
And I think another high-level question from the audience was, if you look at climate change and what's happened in the Industrial Revolution and the rate of fossil fuel emissions, and in light of what's happening today with these extreme weather events, what's our world going to look like in 50 years from now? And here we are in the midst of a strong hurricane going up the coast. And what can we expect to see in our world 50 years from now?
Well, we've just had, I think this summer, I feel like we've turned a corner, in my mind, this summer with some of the fires we've seen. And for example, people on the East Coast now experiencing, ash from fires. And it's like, oh, we just heard about that. But until you experience it, you're like, whoa, is this going to be our world 50 years from now? And feeling it in a very personal way, we're going to have, we're going to have to adapt. People are going to be not being able to live in some of the places they're living now, probably within years. And we're going to lose more species in the ocean. So there's a lot of, we do need to act. Those are just a few more.
I would highly recommend that people read Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which provides sort of a beginning view of the potential suffering and magnitude of the harm, but also some of the crazy solutions that are then tried because we haven't done anything today, and the consequences that are borne by future generations. So there are multiple pathways towards a future that are either sustainable or unsustainable, or sustainable for some and unsustainable for many. So we really have to choose now what future we prefer and what actions we need to take now, such as keeping it in the ground, before we try to start thinking about solutions that are going to cost us far more in the long run and may or may not actually work. So I think, as Kakani said, we need to integrate and immediately implement those actions that are actionable now if we are going to create a pathway towards it. Otherwise, the consequences are bleak.
Hey,
thank you.
There are two right in the front. Those would be two last questions. You, sir? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I wonder if and it's just a question for everyone, maybe we should help the business community by offering up the questions they should ask. And I don't know what those are, but as a business person, a lot of times they don't, well, what's the problem we're supposed to solve from a business perspective? And just a comment, it's a question. And
we'll take the next one also, and then, we'll go back to the panelists. Yes.
Hi, Paul Berkman, Science Diplomacy Center. Following up on the observation about discontent in the community in general sense, the Paris Accord is held out as an important step in terms of addressing the Earth's climate. The word water isn't mentioned once in the Paris Accord. If the objective is to come up with combinations of governance mechanisms and built infrastructure to sustainably migrate into the future, presumably forever in terms of climate, how do we bring water into these international governance solutions dealing with climate?
Kristina, I think that's for you.
I think we need another conference. That was, I think policymakers, at least the United Nations, are attempting to deal with these issues, but still on a very siloed basis. They recently had a freshwater conference, and then they have a climate change conference. So we probably need to get more physical oceanographers involved in these discussions about the importance of water and its origin in the ocean and how it ends up on land and the relationship with salinity. I think it's critical questions, but it's the freshwater debate that is going to be of most urgent concern, because we are starting to run out of fresh water, and we are going to get many potential conflicts arising over how we're not sustaining our current water resource. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge part of the problem. It's generally based from the terrestrial perspective, but we need an Earth systems perspective if we're really.
Good. If there are any 30-second closing comments from the panelists, starting with Ken and coming this way. What would you like the audience to take away, both here and online?
I mean, the biological carbon pump matters. It is a true hero. And so I think this urgency that we're seeing with the climate crisis, we don't have to really explain to audiences, but the value of that service to our planet, I think, is something we have to do and study. And I think that's on us, but it's also on trying to convince others, those billionaires out there, to help make that happen, our governments, our agencies, and then through proper policy and decisions, do that in a responsible way. But I'm not going to wait for those governance agreements to be all signed and ratified. We don't have to. We should start now.
Excellent. Debbie?
Yeah, I think I would just say how important education is, just educating ourselves, all of us, about you know, the importance of the ocean and the ecosystem services that it provides to humankind through food and all sorts of things that we humans need. And so just taking that step to educate yourself and your neighbor, and for all of us to be more active in saying, yeah, the oceans are important and we care about them, and we need to have an understanding of them so that policymakers can do the right thing.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, Dr. David Ho, who's a professor at University of Hawaii, wrote a piece, I think it was in the Science magazine a couple months, years, I don't know, pandemic ago. And one of the things that really resonated me with this piece was that in all of human history, we've never successfully removed an environmental pollutant at scale. You know what we did? We just stopped releasing that environmental pollutant. And we allowed the planet to resolve that for us, right? And so I think, you know, it's wonderful to think about, you know, additional solutions, trying to figure out ways to perhaps have the ocean sequester more carbon. But if we don't stop, right, emissions, burning of fossil fuels, all of these discussions are going to fall away. So I think, you know, being very proactive. I mean, as a private citizen, I think I could say this. I think people should be voting and talking to people who are supportive for really reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Like that, without that, this isn't going to work.
You have the last word.
What she said.
Well, on that note, I want to thank all of you for your time here. Despite the weather, you braved it and you're here. And to thank all the people that joined us online. And of course, I want to thank in particular Morse for making it possible for us to have this colloquium. And most importantly, I want all of you to join me in thanking our panelists, Peter Thompson and James Cameron, for their invaluable insights.